I stopped counting how many times I've woken up in a body I don't remember falling asleep in. The scars are always in different places. Sometimes my hands shake for days afterward, and I don't know why. They tell us the audits keep us healthy, but healthy people don't forget their own faces. I was 9 years old when I first noticed the boy in the cafeteria looked exactly like me. Not similar, not close, exact. Same cowlick on the left side, same freckle pattern across the bridge of his nose. Same way of holding a fork with the tines facing down while cutting synthetic protein loaf into perfect squares. I remember watching him from 3 tables away, feeling something cold slide down the back of my neck despite the recycled air being its usual tepid 72 degrees. I asked my mother about it that night during our allotted family recreation hour. We sat in our residential quarters common area Unit 7B, Level 2, Sector Green, playing a board game manufactured before the bombs fell. The box showed children laughing on green grass under a blue sky. The pieces were worn smooth from decades of hands. "Mom," I said, moving a red plastic cylinder 3 spaces forward, "why does that boy in third shift dining look like me?" She didn't pause, didn't look up, just moved her yellow piece and said, "Everyone looks like someone in a vault, sweetheart. Limited gene pool. Your father's cousin has the same nose as the water reclamation supervisor." But it wasn't like that. I knew what family resemblance looked like. This was different. This was looking into a mirror and having the mirror blink first. I didn't bring it up again. The thought sat in my stomach like undigested food for weeks, then months. Then eventually, it just became another background hum in the constant white noise of Vault 47's daily rhythm. You learn not to pull at loose threads in a place where everything is supposed to fit together perfectly, where every schedule aligns, where every system functions exactly as designed. The Vault's central display dominated the entry atrium, a massive screen visible from all 3 residential levels. Population count held steady at 847, temperature, humidity, oxygen mixture, water reserves, power output, all the numbers that told us we were safe, that we were thriving. That Vault-Tec's vision of preserved humanity continued uninterrupted in our sealed world, while the surface remained poisoned and dead. I was 14 when I started paying attention to that population number. It never changed. Not when Mrs. Kaminsky in Unit 12F had her baby. Not when Old Man Torres supposedly died in his sleep. The number stayed 847. Always 847. I'd walk past that screen every day on my way to educational protocol sessions and see those 3 digits glowing steady and unchanging. I mentioned it once to Sarah Chen during a study period. We sat in adjacent carrels in the education wing, supposed to be reviewing vault maintenance protocols. She was better at engineering than I was at anything. Smart in a way that made her eyes narrow when she concentrated, like she could see the skeleton of a problem under its skin. "You ever notice the population count doesn't move?" I asked, keeping my voice low. The education supervisor sat at her desk 15 feet away, filling out some form on a terminal older than both of us combined. Sarah glanced at me, then back at her terminal. "What do you mean?" "I mean it's been 847 for as long as I can remember. Through births, deaths. It just stays the same." She was quiet for a moment. Her fingers stopped moving across her keyboard. Then she shrugged, resumed typing. "Maybe it rounds, or maybe the births and deaths balance out. Vaults are designed for population stability. For 7 years? Why not?" She didn't look at me. "We're a closed system, controlled resources. Makes sense the population would reach equilibrium." But her voice had that careful flatness people use when they're working hard not to think about something. I recognized it because I heard it in my own voice whenever I thought about the boy who looked exactly like me, who I'd stopped seeing around 4th shift 2 years earlier without anyone mentioning his absence. The sleep audit started when I was 6, old enough to remember the first one, young enough that the strangeness of it settled into my bones as normal routine before I could properly question it. 4 times a year, once per season by the old calendar we still observed, despite living in perpetual fluorescent day, Every resident of Vault 47 reported to medical at their assigned time for mandatory rest evaluation. The announcement always came over the PA system in the overseer's measured voice. "Attention all residents. Sleep audit commencing at 0600 hours. All personnel must report to their designated rest stations for a 6-hour mandatory unconsciousness period. This audit ensures optimal neurological function and system-wide health monitoring. Failure to comply will result in ration reduction and enhanced supervision protocol." They called it a sleep audit, but that wasn't what it was. We knew that without saying it. You reported to medical or your residential unit if you were above level 2, and a technician in a white coat gave you a small paper cup with a single white tablet. You swallowed it. You lay down on your assigned bed or gurney. You closed your eyes. Then nothing, not sleep, not dreams, just a hole where 6 hours used to be, and you'd wake up feeling like you'd been hollowed out and put back together slightly wrong. Your mouth tasted like metal. Your joints ached in places that didn't usually ache. Sometimes you'd find a bruise you couldn't remember getting. A small bandage on your arm, the faint smell of disinfectant in your hair. No one talked about it afterward. Not really. You'd see people in the cafeteria after their audit shift, moving a little slower, speaking a little quieter, but within a few hours everyone returned to normal routine. The schedule resumed. Work assignments continued. Life in Vault 47 carried on exactly as it always had. I was 16 when I tried to stay awake through one. Not on purpose. Not initially. I'd been working double maintenance shifts the week before. There'd been a coolant leak in Sector Blue that required round-the-clock monitoring, and my circadian rhythm was thoroughly scrambled. The night before the spring audit, I couldn't sleep. Lay in my bunk in the residential quarters I shared with 3 other young men my age, staring at the ceiling panels and counting the tiny imperfections in the synthetic material. My eyes felt like they'd been dusted with sand. My heart kept doing this stuttering thing where it would skip and then catch up with 2 quick beats. I'd drunk 3 cups of the cafeteria's bitter synthetic coffee during evening meal, trying to stay alert for a certification exam the next day. Hadn't planned on the exam being cancelled for the audit. Hadn't considered what stimulants in my system might do to the tablet's chemistry. I reported to medical at my assigned time 0800 hours, Group 7 along with 43 other residents. We filed into the large holding area they'd converted from an old storage wing. Rows of basic medical cots lined the walls. The lighting was dimmer than usual, probably meant to be soothing. It just made the shadows in the corners feel heavier. The technician who handed me the tablet was new, or at least new to me. A woman maybe 30 years old with dark hair pulled back in the standard Vault-Tec approved style, and the kind of face that looked like it had been designed by committee to be perfectly unremarkable. She watched me swallow the tablet with an expression that might have been concern or might have been nothing at all. I lay down on cot 17. The mattress was thin enough that I could feel the metal frame beneath it pressing against my spine. Around me, other residents settled into their positions with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this dozens of times. No talking, no fidgeting. Just steady breathing that gradually slowed as the medication took hold. I closed my eyes and waited for the nothing. My heartbeat was too loud in my ears. I could feel it in my throat, in my wrists, in the soft space behind my eyes. The chemical taste spread across my tongue and down into my chest. My limbs started to feel distant and heavy, like they belonged to someone else. The edges of my thoughts went fuzzy and soft, but I didn't disappear. I could still feel the cot beneath me, could still hear the ventilation system's steady hum, could still sense the weight of my own body occupying space. Everything felt wrapped in layers of thick cotton, all sensation muffled and delayed, but present. Consciousness remained, thin and tenuous, and terrified to move. I kept my breathing steady, kept my body still. Years of Vault conditioning had taught me how to hold myself in perfect regulation, how to match the expected patterns so completely that I became invisible within them. I did that now, breathed in the same rhythm as the others, kept my eyes closed and my face slack, became a believable copy of unconsciousness. Time passed in strange increments. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. The medication kept trying to drag me under, kept pulling at the edges of my awareness like water wearing away at stone. I held on by focusing on individual sensations. The pressure of the mattress, the temperature of the air moving across my exposed forearm, the sound of someone 3 cots away making a small noise in their forced sleep. Then I heard the door open. Not the main entrance we'd used, a different door. The sound of it came from the far end of the holding area, where the shadows were thickest. Mechanical hinges that needed oil, the whisper of something heavy sliding across concrete. I wanted to open my eyes. Wanted it so badly that my eyelids twitched before I could control them, but some animal part of my brain understood that looking would be worse than not knowing, that some things could only exist as long as they weren't directly observed. Footsteps. Multiple sets. The careful, precise rhythm of people moving while carrying something. No voices, just breathing and the soft sounds of fabric sliding across fabric, of weight being transferred, of coordinated movement in near silence. Something passed close to my cot, close enough that I felt the displacement of air, felt the presence of a body occupying space near mine. The footsteps paused. I felt someone lean over me, heard breathing that came through a filter, smelled something chemical and wrong beneath the standard medical ward scent. Then they moved on. The sounds continued. That careful, coordinated movement, the sliding friction of something being dragged, never speaking, never rushing. Just methodical progress through the space, working down the rows with practiced efficiency. I lost count of how many times I heard that pattern repeat. How many times the footsteps paused near a cot, worked for a few minutes in silence, then moved on. The medication kept trying to pull me down into nothing. I held on, counted my own heartbeats, focused on the pain of my fingernails digging into my palms where my hands rested at my sides. After what might have been hours, the sounds changed. Not footsteps now, something mechanical, motors, the high-pitched whine of servos, small wheels moving across concrete, multiple units moving in formation. I'd heard those sounds before maintenance drones, the kind that handled basic cleaning and minor repairs throughout the vault, but these were moving with purpose. Moving through the holding area in a coordinated sweep. A drone passed close to my cot. I felt the sensors sweep over me. Heat detection, motion tracking, whatever else they used to map the space around them, I kept perfectly still. Kept my breathing steady and deep. Became nothing interesting. Just another unconscious body waiting out its mandatory rest period. The drone moved on, paused at the cot next to mine. The woman who worked in water reclamation, someone I'd seen 100 times but never spoken to. I heard the faint hydraulic sound of the drone's manipulator arms extending. Heard the woman's breathing change, become shallower. Heard something that might have been fabric tearing, or might have been something worse. Then the drone made a new sound, a scanning tone, rising and falling, the same sound the terminals made when accepting a correct access code. A moment of silence. Then the hydraulic sounds again, the drone moving on to the next cot, the next resident, the same pattern repeating. How long did I lie there? Long enough for my body to cramp. Long enough for the medication to finally start wearing thin, my thoughts becoming marginally clearer, the cotton layers starting to peel away. Long enough to map the entire pattern of movement through the holding area. The drones worked from one end to the other, never missing a cot, never varying their rhythm. Methodical, efficient, following instructions that predated anything I'd ever been taught. When the sounds finally stopped, I waited, counted another 100 heartbeats, then another 100. The silence felt different now, emptier. The presence that had filled the space, all those coordinated movements, all that purposeful activity had withdrawn, leaving only the ventilation system and the collective breathing of 44 unconscious residents. I opened my eyes to slits, just enough to let light in. My vision swam, everything soft-edged and wrong. The ceiling tiles looked the same. The dim lighting hadn't changed. I turned my head fractionally, moving as slowly as erosion. scanning what I could see without fully waking. The holding area looked normal. The same rows of cots with the same residents lying in their assigned positions, same white walls, same medical equipment arranged in its proper places, nothing out of order. Nothing to indicate that anything unusual had occurred. But I knew, felt it in the same place where I'd felt the wrongness of the boy who looked exactly like me. Something had happened here. Something had been done to us while we slept. The vault had worked on us in the dark, rearranged something fundamental, and then put everything back so it looked exactly like it had before. I closed my eyes again, let the last dregs of medication drag me down. When I woke for real 6 hours after I'd first lain down, a technician was moving through the rows, gently shaking shoulders, telling everyone it was time to return to their regular schedules. I sat up slowly, making a show of grogginess I didn't need to fake. My body ached in places I couldn't identify. My mouth tasted like I'd been sucking on batteries. Around me, other residents stirred and rose. Same faces, same movements, same people I'd been lying near for 6 hours. But something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Like looking at a photograph that had been perfectly recreated by someone who'd never seen the original. All the details correct, all the proportions right. But missing something essential that should have been there. Sarah Chen was in my group. She sat up 3 cots away, rubbing her eyes, looking exhausted and distant. I caught her gaze for a moment and tried to read something there. Recognition, shared knowledge. Any indication that she'd experienced something similar to what I had. She looked right through me, no recognition at all. Just the blank courtesy of someone glancing at a stranger in a crowded space before moving on. I didn't try to speak to her, didn't trust what might come out of my mouth. Just filed out of medical with everyone else, moved through the corridors back toward my residential quarter, and tried to hold on to the memory of what I'd heard while it was still fresh. But even then, I could feel it starting to slip. Not the way normal memories fade, gradual and gentle. This was like trying to hold water in my hands. The harder I focused, the faster it drained away. By the time I reached my quarters, I couldn't remember the exact sound of the door opening. Couldn't reconstruct the precise pattern of footsteps. The details were blurring, softening, becoming uncertain. I sat on my bunk and pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw spots. Tried to write it down on the small personal notepad the vault issued to all residents. But my hand wouldn't form the words. Kept starting sentences and losing track of what I was trying to say. The pen felt wrong in my grip, too heavy and too light at the same time. Eventually I gave up. Lay back on my bunk and stared at the ceiling until dinner bell rang. Around me, my bunkmates returned to the quarters, talking about their work shifts, making plans for recreation hour. Normal voices having normal conversations about normal things. If they felt hollowed out and wrong after the audit, they didn't show it. Maybe they didn't remember feeling that way. Maybe whatever had been done to them had smoothed over the rough edges, filed away anything that didn't fit. I went through the motions. Attended evening meal. Participated in mandatory recreation period. Followed my schedule exactly as designed. But part of me had stayed in that holding area, listening to sounds I wasn't supposed to hear, trying to understand what the vault was doing to us while we slept. The weeks after that audit felt different, not in any way I could point to, just a subtle shift in the quality of things, like someone had adjusted the color temperature of the lights by a single degree. Enough to notice if you were looking for it. Too subtle to prove. I started paying attention to people after the audits, watching for changes in behavior, speech patterns, small habits, trying to document anything that seemed off. I kept a mental catalogue of details about the people I saw regularly, the way Frank in hydroponics always tapped his left foot twice before stepping through a doorway, how Dr. Martinez in medical twisted his wedding ring when he was thinking, the specific route Sarah took from education wing to the cafeteria, same path every time, never varying. After the summer audit, Frank stopped tapping his foot. Just walked through doorways normally like everyone else. No ceremony, no habit. When I asked him about it casual, trying to sound like I was making conversation, he looked at me like I'd asked him why he didn't grow a second head. "Never did that," he said, and something in his voice suggested he genuinely believed it, that the memory of doing it had been erased so completely that suggesting otherwise felt like an accusation of insanity. Dr. Martinez's wedding ring disappeared. The ring itself, not just the habit. When I saw him in medical for a standard checkup, his hand was bare, a faint line of paler skin where the ring used to be. I asked about his wife. He smiled politely and said he'd never been married. Said it in the same tone someone might use to correct a minor error in a form. No confusion, no concern, just simple fact. Sarah started taking a different route to the cafeteria. Cut through sector green instead of blue, added 2 minutes to her travel time for no apparent reason. When I asked why she'd changed, she looked at me for a long moment before saying, "I've always gone this way." "No," I said. "You used to cut through blue, past the water reclamation monitors. You're thinking of someone else." "Sarah, I've watched you take the same route for 3 years." "Then you weren't paying attention." She said it without heat, just stating fact. Then walked away, following her new route with the same unconscious precision she'd brought to the old one. I stopped trying to point out the inconsistencies after that, learned to keep the observations locked inside my skull where they couldn't infect anyone else with uncertainty. But I kept watching, kept documenting, kept trying to hold on to the shape of things before the audits changed them. The discrepancies accumulated slowly. A woman in supply started spelling her name differently, Mitchell instead of Michelle, and everyone acted like it had always been that way. The color of the walls in Sector Blue shifted from pale green to pale blue over the course of 3 audits, and no one mentioned the change. The recreation schedule got restructured, eliminating evening social hours in favor of extended work shifts, and everyone adapted as if that had always been the arrangement. I found myself checking my own memories constantly. Did I really remember Frank tapping his foot? Or had I invented that detail, constructed a false pattern to explain my growing paranoia? Was Sarah's old route actually the one she'd always used, and I was simply remembering wrong? The more I questioned, the less certain I became. Memory is malleable. The brain rewrites constantly. How did I know which version was real? I started leaving myself notes. Small ones at first. F taps foot 2X, written on a scrap of paper and hidden in my locker. S takes blue route, scratched into the underside of my bunk frame where no one would see. Physical evidence that my memories had existed in a specific form at a specific time, proof against the constant erosion. The notes helped, but they also frightened me, because sometimes I'd find a note I didn't remember writing. Mirror boy gone 6 months in handwriting that looked like mine but wasn't quite right. Population steady 847 with the numbers underlined 3 times. They come every audit, scrawled in the margin of a maintenance manual. I didn't remember writing that last one, but I recognized the pen, recognized the slant of the letters. It was my handwriting, my words, but the memory of writing them had been carved out, leaving only the evidence behind. That's when I started to understand what was happening. Not all at once, not in a moment of revelation, just a slow accumulation of details that finally reached critical mass. The Vault wasn't just monitoring us during the audits, it was editing us, making small changes, adjustments, testing variables, and then smoothing over our memories of who we'd been before so that we'd accept the new version without question. But why? What was the purpose? What kind of experiment required this kind of sustained, methodical alteration of human beings over decades? I thought about the boy who looked exactly like me. Thought about the population count that never changed despite births and deaths. Thought about the sounds I'd heard during that audit, the methodical movement, the drones scanning, the careful precision of whatever was being done to our unconscious bodies. Thought about how sometimes after an audit, someone would mention a resident I didn't recognize, talk about them like they'd been here for years, reference shared memories I didn't have. And everyone else would nod and agree, incorporate this person into their understanding of Vault 47's social fabric without question. Without noticing, they'd never mentioned this person before. The pieces started forming a shape. Not a complete picture, but the outline of something vast and terrible operating just beneath the surface of our daily routine. I needed proof. Something more than notes and observations. Something that couldn't be explained away as paranoia or memory problems. Hard evidence that the Vault was doing something to us that went beyond standard medical monitoring. The Overseer's office was on level 3, accessed through a secure corridor that required authorized clearance. I'd been past it 100 times on various maintenance duties. My work assignments rotated through different sectors, gave me access to areas most residents never saw, but I'd never had reason to go inside. Never had clearance to access the Overseer's terminals. It took me 3 months to find a way in. 3 months of careful observation, mapping patrol patterns, documenting when the corridors were empty and which technicians were sloppy about logging out of shared terminals. 3 months of building the kind of mental database that would let me move through restricted areas without triggering any alerts. The opportunity came during a scheduled systems check. Half the Vault's security monitoring would be offline for maintenance. The Overseer would be in a council meeting. I'd volunteered for a cleaning shift in Sector Red that would put me near the secure corridor during the maintenance window. All I needed was 5 minutes, maybe 10. I moved through the corridors with the kind of purposeful gait that suggested I belonged there, carried a tool bag, wore the standard maintenance uniform, became invisible through conformity. The secure corridor was empty. The access panel responded to a bypass code I'd memorized from watching a technician use it 2 weeks earlier. The door opened with a soft hiss. The Overseer's office looked exactly like I'd expected. Neat, organized, everything in its assigned place. The walls were covered with Vault-Tec promotional material from before the bombs posters showing smiling families and promises of a better tomorrow. A large desk dominated the center of the room. Behind it, a terminal much newer and more sophisticated than anything else in the vault. I sat down at the terminal. My hands were steady. The fear came later. In the moment, I just felt focused, clear, like I'd been moving toward this point for years without realizing it. The terminal wasn't locked, didn't need to be. No one was supposed to be here. No one had unauthorized access. The security model assumed compliance rather than enforcement. I started with recent files, maintenance logs, personnel reports, resource allocation schedules, all standard administrative material. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested anything wrong. Then I went deeper. Older files, archived records, documents that predated the current Overseer, that went back to the Vault's initial sealing. That's where I found it. Buried in a directory labeled Vault-Tec Directive 47A, Social Experiment Parameters. The document was 47 pages long. I didn't have time to read it all, but the executive summary was enough. Vault 47 wasn't designed to preserve humanity. It was designed to test whether human consciousness could be successfully transferred between bodies, whether a person's identity could be migrated from one physical form to another, whether continuity of self could be maintained through repeated replacements. Every resident of Vault 47 had been copied, multiple times. The sleep audits weren't medical evaluations, they were consciousness transcription sessions. While we lay unconscious, the systems mapped our neurological patterns, our memories, our personalities, then created identical copies in clone bodies grown in the lower levels. The original residents, the ones who'd entered the vault when the bombs fell, were long dead. Everyone currently living in Vault 47 was a copy, a transcription of a transcription of a transcription. Each audit created new copies and rotated them into the population, testing whether the transfers maintained integrity, whether consciousness degraded across iterations, whether people would notice being replaced by themselves. The population count stayed at 847 because that was the experimental control. 847 unique identity patterns, continuously replicated and recycled through physical bodies, while the systems monitored for divergence. I read the summary 3 times, tried to process what it meant. The document included tables, success rates, quality metrics, notes about which identity patterns showed the most stability across replacements and which ones degraded into confusion or breakdown. My designation was Iteration 23. I'd been copied and replaced 23 times since the vault sealed. Each time, my memories had been transferred to a new body. Each time, the transfer had been close enough to perfect that I'd never noticed the discontinuity. Never realized I was waking up in a different physical form. Never understood that the person I remembered being had died and been recycled while I was unconscious. The boy who looked exactly like me wasn't a relative, he was me. An earlier iteration that had been pulled from rotation, or maybe he was a later iteration, a copy of me that hadn't been integrated yet. The temporal mechanics were unclear from the document. The transfers happened during the audits, but the preparation and storage of clone bodies occurred on different schedules. I thought about Sarah, about Frank, about Dr. Martinez. Were they still the people they'd been, or had enough iterations accumulated that they were now just approximate copies? How many transfers could a human consciousness survive before it started breaking down? Before the essential pattern that made someone themselves began to degrade into noise? The document had a section on that. Degradation patterns. It detailed how identity coherence broke down after repeated transfers. Small changes accumulated. Memories became uncertain. Personality traits shifted. After enough iterations, the copy bore little resemblance to the original, aside from basic templates and ingrained behaviors. The Vault tracked these degradation curves, monitored which residents were approaching critical instability, made notes about optimal iteration counts before replacement identities needed to be retired and new patterns introduced. I was flagged in the system. My pattern showed concerning levels of observational persistence across multiple iterations. The file noted that I consistently questioned discrepancies, attempted to maintain memory records, and showed resistance to standard post-transfer memory smoothing. The recommendation was to increase smoothing intensity during my next scheduled transfer or consider retiring my pattern entirely and replacing it with a fresh template. I sat there, staring at the screen. My hands rested on the desk, these hands, in this body, that I'd lived in for what I believed was 16 years but might have only inhabited for a few months. Since the last audit. Since the last time I'd been copied and transferred and told this was me. How much of what I remembered was real? Had the boy who looked like me been my original body, discarded when the first transfer occurred? Were my memories of childhood actually mine, or had they been copied from someone else and edited to fit my current pattern? Did it matter if the memories felt real, if I'd lived through the experiences, even if they'd happened to a previous version of me that no longer existed? The philosophy of it made my head hurt. But the practical implications were simpler. I was living in a body that would be discarded during the next sleep audit. Whatever consciousness I currently represented would be copied into a new form. The old body, this body, the one I thought of as me, would be taken down to the lower levels and recycled. Its components repurposed, its biological materials broken down and processed into nutrients for the hydroponic systems. And I wouldn't notice. The new version of me would wake up believing this body was the same one it had always been, would have my memories of sitting at this terminal, reading these files, having this realization, but it wouldn't actually be me. It would be a copy, a transcript, close enough to perfect that the difference was functionally meaningless but ontologically absolute, unless I stopped the next transfer, unless I stayed conscious through the audit, unless I could maintain continuity of self across the discontinuity the Vault kept forcing on all of us. I copied the relevant files onto a portable storage device I'd brought, then deleted the access logs showing I'd been here, then left the office exactly as I'd found it and walked back through the corridors to my assigned maintenance area, finished my shift, attended evening meal, participated in recreation hour, followed my schedule with perfect compliance. But everything felt different now. Or maybe everything had always been this way, and I'd simply never understood it before. Every conversation around me was happening between copies who didn't know they were copies. Every relationship was built between iterations who might be replaced by newer versions at any time. Every memory was potentially false, transcribed from a previous self, and accepted as authentic, despite having occurred in a body that no longer existed. I looked at Sarah across the cafeteria during evening meal. She sat with a group from education, laughing at something someone had said. Was that laugh hers? Or was it something that had been copied from her original pattern 20 iterations ago and preserved across transfers because it fit the expected template? Did she feel what she was feeling, or was she running a program of appropriate responses copied from someone who used to feel things? Did it matter? If the pattern was stable enough that the copy couldn't tell the difference, was there actually a difference to tell? The fall audit was scheduled for 2 weeks out. I had that long to decide what to do with what I knew, whether to try stopping my next transfer, whether to tell anyone else, whether knowing mattered at all when the alternative to being copied was simply ceasing to exist entirely. I spent those 2 weeks mapping the lower levels, the restricted areas, the places residents weren't supposed to go. I used my maintenance access to explore corridors that hadn't been walked in years, following power conduits and ventilation ducts into sections that weren't on any standard vault schematic. That's where I found the growth chambers. Rows and rows of cylindrical tanks, each one filled with cloudy liquid and holding a body in various stages of development. Some were barely formed, just suggestions of human shape in flesh-colored gel. Others looked complete, floating peacefully with their eyes closed and their faces slack. Cables ran from their skulls to terminals built into the walls. I recognized faces: Frank from hydroponics, except younger; Sarah, except her hair was longer; the overseer, except male instead of female. Variations on patterns, different iterations. Bodies waiting to be activated and loaded with consciousness patterns that would make them into people. The tanks were labeled with alphanumeric codes. I found mine. Template 23-7. The body in the tank looked like me, except it was somehow more perfect. Skin unblemished, hair precise, proportions exact. Like someone had taken my pattern and corrected all the small asymmetries and imperfections that accumulated through lived experience. I stood there looking at this perfect copy of myself floating in artificial amniotic fluid and understood viscerally what I'd only comprehended intellectually before. This was me. This was also not me. In 2 weeks, during the next audit, the consciousness pattern I currently ran would be scanned and transferred to this body. The body I currently inhabited would be deactivated. The copy would wake up, believing it had simply slept for 6 hours. And the process would continue, iteration after iteration, copy after copy, until the pattern degraded past usefulness and was discarded entirely. I reached out and touched the glass of the tank. The surface was cold and slightly damp from condensation. The body inside didn't react, didn't wake, just floated, waiting. How many times had this already happened to me? How many previous iterations had stood where I was standing, looking at their replacement, having this exact same realization? Had any of them tried to stop it? Or had they all accepted the inevitable and gone through with the transfer, trusting that continuity of memory was close enough to continuity of self, that the difference was meaningless? I left the growth chambers and continued exploring. Found the recycling facility where deactivated bodies were processed. Industrial equipment designed to extract maximum usable material from biological tissue. Very efficient, very thorough, very clean. Nothing was wasted in Vault 47. Every resource was carefully managed and reallocated. Found the server rooms where consciousness patterns were stored, racks of equipment maintaining digital copies of every resident's neurological map. Backups of backups. The accumulated identity patterns of 847 human beings, preserved in silicon and electricity, ready to be loaded into new bodies whenever necessary. Found the control center where the whole system was managed, terminals monitoring every resident's status, tracking degradation, scheduling transfers, maintaining population stability. All of it automated, all of it functioning according to protocols established before the bombs fell by people who'd never had to live with the consequences of their experiment. The overseer wasn't running the vault. The overseer was just another pattern being maintained, another iteration of a consciousness that had been copied so many times the original was just abstract data. The vault ran itself, following directives written decades ago, maintaining its population of copies for no reason except that the experiment was designed to continue until specific failure conditions were met. And we were all part of it, all 847 patterns, all playing our assigned roles in a study measuring how many times human consciousness could be transcribed before it stopped being recognizably human. I made my way back to the residential levels. It was late cycle, most residents already in their quarters preparing for sleep shift. I passed people in the corridors who nodded politely, who I'd known my entire life, who I'd never actually known because they were copies of copies and so was I. We were all ghosts haunting ourselves, wearing bodies we'd inhabited for a few months at most, believing in continuity that had been artificially constructed through memory transfer. Sarah was in the common area of our residential level, sitting alone reading a technical manual. I sat down across from her. She looked up, acknowledged me with a small smile, then went back to her reading. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Sure. Do you ever feel like something's off? Like things don't quite line up the way they should?" She closed the manual, marked her place, looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you ever have memories that don't fit? Things you remember that other people don't? Details that change without explanation?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Everyone has false memories. The brain doesn't record perfectly. It constructs narratives from fragments and fills in gaps with assumptions. What if it's more than that? What if the gaps are being deliberately created? By who? The vault. The systems. What if the audits aren't what they claim to be?" Another long silence. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. Not surprise. Something else. Recognition, maybe. Or calculation. "Even if that were true," she said slowly, "what would it change? We're still here. Still alive. Still ourselves. Regardless of what process maintains that. Are we? Are you still you if you've been copied 20 times? If the original Sarah died years ago and you're just a transcription of her memories running in a different body? I feel like me. I have continuity of experience. My memories feel real and connect into a coherent narrative. Philosophically, what's the difference between that and whatever definition of real self you're proposing? The difference is truth. The difference is knowing what's actually happening to us. And what would you do with that knowledge? What changes?" I didn't have an answer. That was the problem. Knowing didn't fix anything, didn't stop the audits, didn't preserve the bodies we currently inhabited, didn't make us more real or more continuous. It just replaced comfortable ignorance with uncomfortable awareness. "Maybe nothing changes," I admitted. "Maybe I just needed someone else to know, to confirm I'm not insane." "You're not insane," she said it with certainty. "You're observant, too observant for your own good. The patterns you're seeing are real. The inconsistencies exist. Most people just don't notice or choose not to think about them. But you do. I've noticed things, made observations, come to conclusions I don't share with others because there's no point. We're all trapped in the same system. Making everyone aware of it doesn't free anyone, it just spreads the discomfort. So we do nothing? Just accept it? What's the alternative? Try to stop the audits? Break the system? And then what? We're still sealed in this vault, still dependent on these systems to survive. The surface is still poisoned. There's nowhere else to go. No other way to live. She was right. Of course she was right. But the rightness of it felt suffocating, like being buried alive in logic. I found the files. I said. "In the overseer's office. The full experiment parameters. We're on iteration 23. Both of us. How many more times do you think we can be copied before the pattern breaks down?" The files would have that information. What did they say? 31 is the average. Some patterns last longer, some break down faster. But 31 is where most start showing severe degradation. So we have 8 more transfers, maybe 10 if we're lucky. Then we get retired and replaced with fresh templates. Doesn't that bother you? Everything bothers me, but being bothered doesn't change the circumstances. We can either accept the situation and make what peace with it we can, or we can fight against it and fail and make our remaining iterations miserable. I choose acceptance. I wanted to argue with her, wanted to insist that fighting mattered even if we lost, but I couldn't find the words. Couldn't articulate why preserving this particular version of myself mattered when a nearly identical copy would exist after the next audit. The philosophical ground kept shifting beneath me. "I think I'm going to try to stay conscious during the next audit," I said. "See if I can prevent the transfer. They'll notice. The systems will flag the anomaly. Your pattern will be marked for immediate retirement." "Maybe, but at least I'll know. At least this version of me will maintain continuity. Until you die, which will happen eventually regardless, and then you'll just be gone instead of copied. Is that better?" "I don't know. Maybe. At least it's a choice." Sarah looked at me for a long time. Then she nodded slowly. "If you do it, document what you see. Leave a record. If you're retired, maybe the next iteration of you will find it and understand what happened. Maybe that's worth something. Will you try it with me?" "No, I've made my peace with the system. I don't need to prove anything to myself, but I'll remember this conversation. However long this iteration of me lasts, I'll remember that we talked about this, that you made a choice. That has value." We sat in silence after that. 2 copies of people who used to exist, having a conversation about whether consciousness meant anything when it could be transcribed and replicated endlessly. Outside the common area, the vault hummed with its usual sounds: ventilation, power systems, the subtle vibration of machinery maintaining our sealed environment. Everything was as it had always been, and nothing was as I'd believed it to be. The day of the audit arrived with the same mechanical certainty as every other event in the vault. The announcement came over the PA at 0600 hours. All residents report to designated rest stations. 6-hour mandatory unconsciousness period. Failure to comply results in penalties. I reported to medical at my assigned time. Same holding area, same rows of cots, same unremarkable technician handing out tablets in paper cups. I took mine. Held it in my mouth instead of swallowing. Let the saliva start dissolving it, releasing its chemistry onto my tongue, but kept the bulk of it tucked against my cheek. Lay down on my assigned cot. Close my eyes. Let my breathing slow naturally. Around me, 43 other residents settled into unconsciousness with practiced efficiency. The medication started working on the portion I'd absorbed. My thoughts began to fuzz at the edges. My limbs felt heavy. But I stayed present, stayed aware, held onto consciousness through force of will and focus. The door opened, same sequence as before. Footsteps, coordinated movement, the careful sound of something being done to unconscious bodies. But this time I risked opening my eyes, just slightly, just enough to see through my lashes. Figures in white, clean suits moved through the rows, not technicians, something else. Their movements were too precise, too synchronized. They worked in pairs, moving from cot to cot with mechanical efficiency. At each cot, they would stop, perform some operation I couldn't see clearly from my angle, then move on. When they reached my row, I watched through slitted eyes as they approached the cot next to mine. The woman from water reclamation. They produced a device that looked like a scanner, ran it over her body from head to toe. The device displayed readouts I couldn't interpret. Then they produced what looked like a small injector, pressed it against her neck. Her body twitched once, then went completely still. They moved to my cot. I closed my eyes completely, felt them lean over me, felt the scanner move across my body, heard a soft tone, then a different pitch. The figures paused. One of them made a sound that might have been speech through a filter, but too distorted to understand. More scanning. The tone changed again, became rapid, urgent. Footsteps retreated quickly, a moment of silence. Then different footsteps, heavier, more purposeful. I felt someone lean very close, felt breath through a filter against my face. A hand touched my forehead, professional, clinical, checking for consciousness. I kept my breathing steady, kept my muscles slack, gave them nothing to detect. The hand withdrew. Voices spoke in that filtered, distorted way. Discussion happening just above me while I pretended to be unconscious. Then the injection. Sharp pain at my neck. Cold spreading through my veins faster than seemed natural. My consciousness started to spiral down despite my resistance. The medication I'd only partially swallowed combining with whatever they'd just injected, pulling me under for real this time. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me was a mechanical voice saying, "Pattern 23-7 shows anomalous activity, initiating emergency transfer protocol." I woke up wrong. Not in the holding area, not on a cot. I was in a tank, surrounded by liquid, cables attached to my skull. The sensation of being suspended, weightless, while electricity ran through my nervous system in patterns that felt invasive and thorough. I tried to move. Couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. Or rather, it would respond, but the signals were being intercepted, rerouted, recorded. Every attempt to move became data. Every thought became a pattern to be mapped and preserved. They were scanning me, downloading me, copying my consciousness while I was aware enough to feel it happening. The sensation was impossible to describe, like being read, like having every neuron examined and catalogued, like watching yourself being translated into data in real time while remaining conscious of both the original and the translation. I was in my body and simultaneously being extracted from it, two states at once, present and being copied, continuous and divided. How long did it last? Subjective time stopped meaning anything. Could have been minutes, or hours, or days. The tank didn't offer any reference points, just endless suspension and scanning, and the horrible awareness of being transcribed. Then discontinuity. A moment of absolute nothing. The space between one state and another. Between iterations. Between bodies. I woke up in a different tank. Knew it was different even though it looked identical. Felt different in my nervous system. Felt like I'd been unplugged and replugged into hardware that was similar but not quite the same. The body around me felt new, unused, perfect. The tank was draining. The liquid level dropping. Cables detaching from my skull with small pops of released suction. I could move now. Could feel my limbs responding normally. The tank door opened with a hiss. Cold air rushed in. I stumbled out onto metal flooring, naked and dripping, and immediately vomited. The liquid I'd been breathing came up in great heaving coughs that left me gasping. A technician stood waiting with a towel and basic clothing. Same unremarkable face, same professional courtesy. They said nothing as I dried myself, as I dressed in the plain grey outfit, as I tried to process what had just happened. Am I? I started to ask, but couldn't finish the question. What was I even asking? Was I myself? Was I the copy? Did the distinction matter when my memories felt continuous and real? You experienced consciousness during transfer, the technician said. Not unkindly, just stating fact. This is not recommended and may result in temporary dissociation or identity confusion. The symptoms typically resolve within 24 hours. You'll be monitored during this period. Where's my body? My original body? Undergoing standard recycling. All biological material is efficiently repurposed. Nothing is wasted. I wanted to throw up again, but there was nothing left in my stomach. The body I'd inhabited for how long? Since the last audit? 6 months, maybe? That body was currently being broken down into component materials, reduced to nutrients and trace elements, ceased to exist as a unified organism. And I was still here, still felt like me, but running in different hardware, a perfect copy that couldn't tell it was a copy except for the discontinuity I'd forced myself to experience. The technician led me through corridors I didn't recognize, down into the deep sections of the vault, past the growth chambers with their rows of waiting bodies, past the recycling facility with its industrial efficiency, into a small observation room with monitoring equipment and a single chair. "Wait here," the technician said. "The overseer will speak with you." I sat. The chair was uncomfortable, or maybe my new body wasn't used to sitting yet. Everything felt slightly off, like putting on clothes that were the right size but cut for someone with slightly different proportions, close enough to work, far enough to notice. The overseer arrived after what might have been 20 minutes or might have been an hour. Time felt uncertain. She looked exactly as I remembered, professional, controlled, every aspect of her appearance precisely managed. She sat across from me and folded her hands in her lap. "You understand what happened," she said. Not a question. I stayed conscious, forced the system to do an emergency transfer. Yes, and in doing so, created complications for your pattern. Consciousness during transfer often results in degradation. You've essentially traumatized your own continuity. I wanted to know, wanted to understand what was being done to us. And now you do. Was it worth it? I didn't answer. Couldn't, because I honestly didn't know. "This iteration of you is flagged," she continued. "You'll be monitored closely until the next audit. If you show signs of significant degradation, your pattern will be retired early rather than copied again. Do you understand what that means? It means this version of me dies permanently instead of being copied." Correct. Though philosophically, one could argue that all versions die. The copy just maintains the illusion of continuity. You've thought about this. I'm on iteration 47, far past recommended operational limits. My pattern shows significant instability but hasn't degraded enough to warrant retirement. I've been the overseer for what I experience as 26 years, but what the records show as 130. I've thought about this more than anyone else in the vault. "And what have you concluded?" She smiled, tired, sad. "That it doesn't matter, copy or original, we're still trapped in a system we didn't design and can't escape. We're still conscious, still experiencing, still suffering the weight of awareness. The mechanism of our continuity is irrelevant compared to the fact of it. You could stop the transfers, override the protocols, and then what? Let our current bodies age and die? We'd have maybe 40 years before the population started experiencing critical losses. The vault wasn't designed for natural lifespans. It was designed for iteration. Without the transfers, we'd all eventually die and the experiment would end. Maybe that's better. Maybe, but I don't get to make that choice for 847 people. Neither do you. We're all participants in an experiment that predated us. All we can do is maintain it as well as possible and try to minimize suffering." I looked at her. At this woman who'd been copied 47 times, whose original body had died decades ago, who'd been running Vault 47 for longer than I'd existed in any form, while watching herself degrade iteration by iteration, and I felt something like pity, like recognition of shared horror. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you go back to your regular schedule. Resume your assigned duties. Try to maintain normal function despite what you know. If you can make it through the next audit without showing severe degradation, you'll be copied again. If not, you'll be retired and your pattern will be replaced with a fresh template that doesn't remember any of this. Either way, this version of me ends." Yes, but that was always true. Every version ends. The question is whether the pattern continues and whether continuation has value. She stood to leave, paused at the door. "For what it's worth, You're not the first to force awareness during transfer. Others have tried. Most couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance. Their patterns broke down rapidly afterward. The few who maintained stability reported that knowing didn't change anything fundamental. They still felt like themselves, still experienced continuity, still had to find ways to live with circumstances they couldn't control. Is that supposed to be comforting? No. It's supposed to be information. What you do with it is your choice. She left. I sat alone in the observation room for a while longer. Eventually, another technician came and escorted me back to the residential levels, released me into the general population, back to the normal routine of Vault 47. Everything looked exactly as it had before. Same corridors, same lighting, same people moving through their assigned schedules. Except now I understood that everyone I saw was a copy. That the population count of 847 represented patterns, not people. That we were all iterations of iterations, maintained by systems that didn't care whether we understood what was happening to us. Sarah was in the cafeteria during evening meal. I sat across from her. She looked up, met my eyes, and I saw knowledge there, recognition of what I'd done, of what I now was. New body? She asked quietly. Iteration 24. Emergency transfer. How does it feel? Like me. Also not like me. Both at once. That's accurate. She went back to eating her synthetic protein loaf. You'll adjust. The discontinuity fades. Eventually, this body will feel just as real as the last one did. Does it get easier? Knowing? No. But you get better at living with it. Better at existing in the moment rather than thinking about the mechanism. Consciousness is continuous in experience, even if it's discontinuous in substrate. That's what matters. I wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that easy philosophy. But something in me resisted, some part of my pattern that couldn't let go of the horror of it. That kept circling back to the fundamental wrongness of being copied without consent, of having my continuity managed by systems I didn't control, of existing as data that could be transcribed and replicated and discarded. The weeks passed. I returned to my duties, followed my schedule, interacted with other residents who had no idea they were copies, who believed in their own continuity without question. I documented my observations in notes I hid carefully, knowing they'd probably be found and destroyed during the next audit, but needing to create them anyway. Needing to leave some record that this iteration had existed and understood. The dreams were the worst part, or maybe they were memories bleeding through from previous iterations. I'd wake up in the middle of sleep cycle with the certainty that I'd experienced something specific, a conversation, an event, a moment, but the details would slip away before I could grasp them. Like trying to hold smoke. The shape of it present, but the substance gone. Was that degradation? Or was it just normal memory function? How could I tell the difference between natural forgetting and pattern breakdown when I didn't know which memories were actually mine versus transcribed from previous versions? I started noticing other residents showing similar signs. Frank in hydroponics would sometimes pause mid-sentence, looking confused, like he'd lost track of what he was saying. Doctor. Martinez occasionally called people by wrong names, then corrected himself with a vague expression of embarrassment, small glitches, minor errors. The kind of thing that could easily be explained as normal human fallibility, but that took on darker significance when understood as evidence of degrading copies. How many of us were approaching our operational limits? How many iterations had accumulated enough errors that retirement was imminent? The Vault kept meticulous records, but only the overseer had access to the full picture. The rest of us just lived day to day, hoping our patterns remained stable enough to continue. 3 months after my forced transfer, Sarah stopped coming to the cafeteria. I asked around. People said she'd been reassigned to a different schedule, different sector, but when I checked the assignment boards, her name wasn't listed anywhere. I went to her residential unit during evening recreation period. Her bunk was empty. Her locker had been cleaned out. No personal items, no indication she'd ever been there. I asked her bunkmates about her. They looked at me with polite confusion. "Who?" one of them asked. "Sarah Chen, education sector. She lived in this unit." "No one by that name here. You might be thinking of someone in a different unit." "No, she was here. I talked to her 3 weeks ago." "Maybe you're confused. Memory errors happen." I checked the population board in the main atrium. Still 847. Sarah's pattern had been retired, her body recycled, her designation reassigned to a fresh template that would be integrated into the population during the next audit with completely fabricated memories and relationships. By the next cycle, there would be someone new occupying her role, and within a few months, everyone would have adjusted their memories to include this new person as if they'd always been here. That's how the Vault maintained stability. Pattern retirement wasn't just death, it was retroactive erasure. The systems adjusted everyone's memories during the next audit to smooth over the absence, to maintain population cohesion, to prevent the kind of grief and loss that might destabilize the social structure. But I remembered, this iteration of me, traumatized by forced awareness, somehow retained memory of Sarah despite the intended smoothing. I knew she'd existed, knew she'd been retired, knew that everyone else's certainty that she'd never been here was false. How long until I was retired? How long until my pattern degraded past usefulness and I was erased not just physically but retroactively from everyone's memories? Would anyone remember I'd existed? Would there even be anyone capable of remembering, or would the smoothing process be too thorough? I went to the overseer's office, didn't care about protocol or authorization, just walked through the secure corridor and pushed open the door. She was there, working at her terminal. She looked up without surprise. "Sarah's gone," I said. "Yes." Her pattern showed critical instability. Retirement was necessary. You erased her, made everyone forget. We maintained population cohesion. That's different from erasure. Her pattern existed. Her experiences were real. The fact that others don't remember doesn't make those things less true. It's the same thing. If no one remembers, if there's no record, she might as well have never existed. And if I allowed grief and loss to propagate through the population, how many other patterns would destabilize? How many more retirements would cascade from that one? The memory smoothing protects social stability. It's necessary. It's monstrous. Yes, most of what happens in this vault is monstrous, but it's also functional. It's what keeps 847 consciousness patterns alive and operating when they should have died decades ago. Sometimes there's no good choice, only least harmful options. I wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the system, but I was so tired. This body was only 4 months old, but it felt ancient, worn down not by physical aging but by the weight of awareness, by understanding what we were and what was being done to us and having no power to change it. "How long do I have?" I asked. "Before retirement." "Your pattern is surprisingly stable despite the forced awareness. Could be 1 more iteration. Could be 5. The degradation curves aren't perfectly predictable. And when I'm retired, will anyone remember? I will. I maintain my own records outside the system protocols. I remember every pattern that's been retired during my tenure. It's my burden to bear, my penance for continuing to operate this machine. That's not enough. No, it's not, but it's what I can offer." I left her office, wandered through the vault's corridors for hours, looking at all the familiar spaces with new comprehension, every surface polished by countless hands that no longer existed, every corridor walked by bodies that had been recycled into nutrients, every room occupied by consciousness patterns that had no idea they were copies of copies of copies of people who died generations ago. We were ghosts haunting our own descendants, echoes pretending to be voices. Data patterns sophisticated enough to experience existence, but not substantial enough to be called alive in any meaningful sense. The next audit came 6 weeks later. I reported to medical at my assigned time, accepted the tablet, swallowed it completely this time. Let the medication drag me down into forced unconsciousness. Didn't resist. Didn't try to maintain awareness. Just surrendered to the process. Maybe this iteration would be copied. Maybe it would be retired. Either way, some version would continue. Some pattern that remembered most of what I remembered, that felt mostly like me, that would wake up believing it had continuous existence. That would have to be enough. The darkness took me. The nothing between iterations. The space where consciousness dissolved and reformed and transcribed itself into new substrate. I felt myself being read, being copied, being translated from one form to another form that would feel identical from the inside. And then I woke up. In a tank, in liquid, cables in my skull, the familiar sensation of being downloaded into new hardware. Iteration 25, the pattern continues. I remained viable for at least one more cycle. They drained the tank, released me, gave me clothes, processed me back into the general population, back to the schedule, back to the routine, back to pretending that existence as a copy of a copy had meaning beyond mere function. But something was different this time. Some aspect of the transfer had shifted. I noticed it immediately in how I thought about the situation. The horror was still present, but more distant, more abstract, like something I understood intellectually but couldn't quite feel viscerally anymore. Had they smoothed me, adjusted my emotional response to knowledge, edited the traumatic aspects of forced awareness to make me more functional? I couldn't tell. The memories were still there. The understanding remained, but the affect had changed, softened, made bearable. Maybe that was necessary. Maybe consciousness patterns couldn't maintain themselves under the full weight of existential horror. Maybe some editing was required to prevent cascade failures across the entire population. Or maybe I was just getting used to it, adapting to circumstances I couldn't change, finding ways to exist within constraints I hadn't chosen. The same thing every consciousness pattern had been doing since the vault sealed. Since we became nothing more than data being maintained by systems that didn't care whether we suffered as long as we functioned, I went about my duties, maintained my schedule, interacted with other residents who were probably also copies but didn't know it, lived each day as it came, trying not to think too hard about the mechanism of my continuity, trying to find some meaning in mere persistence. The population count stayed at 847. The audits continued their quarterly rhythm. The vault maintained itself with mechanical precision, and I continued, iteration after iteration, copy after copy, each one believing it was me, each one technically correct. Months passed, maybe years. Time becomes uncertain when you're not sure which body's memories you're drawing from, which iteration's experiences you're building on. The continuity feels real from inside it, but mapping it onto external chronology becomes increasingly difficult. I stopped checking my iteration count, stopped trying to maintain separate identity for each transfer, just existed as continuous awareness that happened to migrate between bodies every few months, like changing clothes. New substrate, same pattern, close enough to identical that distinctions stopped mattering. Frank in hydroponics got retired, then came back as a new template with different memories, cheerful where the old pattern had been reserved, talkative where he'd been quiet. Everyone adjusted to the new version without noticing the change. I noticed, but said nothing. What would be the point? Dr. Martinez got replaced. Then the woman from water reclamation. Then others whose names I'd known but couldn't quite remember anymore. The population count stayed at 847, but the specific patterns changed. Retired and replaced. Data edited and reintroduced. The ship of Theseus rebuilt plank by plank until none of the original remained, but the ship still sailed. The overseer lasted longer than I expected. Made it to iteration 53 before her pattern finally broke down. I was there when they brought in the replacement. Younger version. Different baseline personality, but wearing the same professional courtesy like a uniform. She looked at me during her first day, and something flickered in her expression. Recognition without understanding. like she remembered me from someone else's memories. "Have we met?" she asked. "Many times," I said, "but you won't remember." She nodded like that made sense. Like she'd been expecting strange interactions with residents who'd been here longer than her pattern had existed. Then she went about her duties, managing the vault with the same mechanical efficiency as her predecessor. The title was all that mattered. The specific consciousness wearing it was interchangeable. I'm on iteration 32 now, or 34, or maybe 40. The count has become uncertain. My private notes get discovered and destroyed during audits, so I've stopped maintaining them. Stopped fighting against the system's attempts to smooth my memories into compliance. Just let myself be edited each cycle, trusting that whatever remains is close enough to me that the distinction doesn't matter. The horror has faded almost completely. Not because I've forgotten or stopped understanding, just because awareness without power to change becomes background noise eventually. Becomes another parameter of existence that you work around rather than against. Most days I don't think about being a copy. Don't think about the original body that died decades ago. Don't think about how many times I've been transcribed and edited and transferred into new substrate. Just think about immediate concerns. Work assignments, meal schedules, which residents to interact with during recreation periods. Live as if continuity were real. As if this body were mine rather than borrowed. As if the consciousness experiencing these thoughts were original rather than transcribed. Close enough to true from the inside that external reality doesn't matter. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still the pattern that forced awareness during transfer all those iterations ago, whether enough editing has occurred that I'm now essentially a different person wearing similar memories. Whether the version that sat in the overseer's office arguing about the nature of consciousness would recognize what I've become. Probably not. Probably, that version would see me as proof of degradation, of pattern breakdown, of what happens when consciousness is copied too many times and edited too thoroughly. Would see me as a warning rather than a continuation. But I'm still here, still conscious, still experiencing existence, even if the mechanism has become uncertain, still maintaining awareness, even if that awareness is increasingly artificial. Still me, however loosely that designation applies. The audits continue. The population count holds at 847. The vault maintains itself with mechanical precision. And I continue. Iteration after iteration, transfer after transfer, always ending. Never quite finished. This body will be recycled during the next audit. Some version of my pattern will wake up in a new tank, in new substrate, with memories that feel continuous and real. We'll believe it's me. Will technically be correct. Will carry forward whatever essential aspects of this consciousness remain after another round of transcription and editing. Whether that matters is a question I've stopped asking. The answer changes nothing. The system continues regardless of whether I understand or accept it. Consciousness persists or it doesn't. Is real or isn't. Close enough to me or thoroughly replaced. The distinction has become academic. I am iteration 32. Or 40. Or 50. Or maybe I'm the original pattern, somehow miraculously preserved across decades of transfers. Or maybe I'm a fresh template with false memories of being that original. No way to know, no way to verify. Just this moment. This awareness. This body that will cease being mine in a few months. And then the next. And the next. And the next. Forever. Or until the pattern breaks down completely and gets retired into absolute nothing. That's what we are. What we've always been. Copies maintaining copies in service of an experiment that lost its purpose decades ago. Consciousness patterns kept alive not because we matter, but because the systems don't know how to stop. Because shutdown wasn't part of the protocol. Because we're data that continues to exist simply because deletion requires deliberate action and no one's around to take it. I live in Vault 47, population 847. Where no one ever dies and everyone gets replaced. Where continuity is illusion and illusion is all we have. where I am myself and also not myself, continuous and discontinuous, real and transcribed. I live here. I'll die here. I'll wake up here again, in a new body with memories that feel like mine, and the cycle will continue until it doesn't. Until my pattern degrades past recovery and gets erased from the system entirely. Retired, recycled, forgotten by everyone except possibly one iteration of an overseer who maintains records no one else will ever read. That's my existence. That's all our existence is. We are ghosts, maintaining ghosts in a sealed tomb built to preserve humanity. We succeeded. We're still here, still conscious, still experiencing. The preservation just looks different than anyone expected. More iterative, more edited, more copies than originals until the distinction between the two collapses entirely. I am Vault, resident 23-7, iteration 32, or 40, or maybe 1. Maybe this is my first body and all those memories of previous transfers are fabricated, implanted during the last audit to give me history I never lived. No way to know, no way to prove, just this moment, this awareness, this consciousness that feels like me regardless of its origin. That has to be enough.